Welcome. Different from my normal stuff on the channel, but I'm going to go into a little tutorial about setting up V-Ray, just some very basics, intro to the software and its interface in Rhino, and talk about just getting a start on a lighting solution before we move anything material based. So I just have a little model here that is a detail from the class we're working on in representation 3 at Pratt. You know, something simple, a little beam, little metal flanges, some bolts, just to give it a little grit and detail, some joists going across, and a couple layers of flooring to give us a lot of stuff to work with in terms of material. Pretty generic, kind of normal detail, but something we can pull apart, put back together, and apply a lot of different materials to. So I'm just starting out. This is our wireframe and just roughly shaded view. If I come here and go to our rendered view, just to see what Rhino shows me, oh, it's got a little baggage going on there, keeping some of the materials from before, which is kind of funny, but that's okay. We can just select everything. Let's go to the properties and make sure that all of our materials are just the default material there. And I'm going to do a little bit of a purge to get everything out of there that I don't need. All right, we should see something like that. Nice and gray. Basic Rhino lighting solution, nothing fancy. It's just showing us what's going on there in the view. Now, Rhino has some built-in nice features like Arctic if you want to check your ambient occlusion, be able to move around just to see volumes and geometry, and that's what we'll kind of explore at first when setting up lighting before we get into materials. It also has a ray trace mode, which right now has a very flat lighting with no atmosphere, so it's going to look pretty flat. But I'll just leave it in this rendered mode here, which should go pretty fast in the viewport. And there we go. We're back just using the standard rendered mode and stay out of ray trace and stuff. So you'll need the V-Ray plugin installed to work with V-Ray. It's a rendering engine, and it'll give you a bunch of toolbars. We really just need this V-Ray all up here, and you can play around with where you put that, but mine's up there. I don't use it too much. Use the V-Ray menu. In order to get it to work, we'll need to make sure that under the render menu, current renderer, V-Ray for Rhino is selected. And if you've installed it and you don't see this, it's possible that the plugin didn't initialize, and you can go to Tools, Options, check your plugins menu down here, and search for V-Ray for Rhino. If it says no, or if it's not checked, you can click on it and go ahead and load it. And you might have to restart. Mine's working here just fine. And right now it's really not doing anything. We just have a basic file. So in the V-Ray menu, or you can type V-Ray and start to see all of these options come up. We want our kind of manager there. And I don't know what it is called here, because that's not how I ever find it. But we'll just come up and click on the asset editor window. I'll bring this little window up here. It's kind of a funny thing at first, right? But it's got a few tabs. It's got materials, lighting, some geometry, render layers, and textures, and then settings, and a couple buttons for starting the rendering modes. Now, there's nothing created yet, so it's not really able to show anything. And it has this weird quirk of these little two clickers on the side to expand it out. On the left side, that brings up the built-in materials library. There's something to start with, you know, not great, not horrible, but usually just kind of generic. And so you might want to experiment with it at first and then start to get your own from websites like Polyhaven or many others out there, or just create them from scratch. So I'll leave that closed for now until we need to start bringing something in. While we're here, we're on the settings panel, and see if we can zoom this in just a little bit too. So maybe a little bit of run through of this, right? Going through all the settings gets a little dry, but it's a good place to start in terms of what we see here. Now, depending on your computer and your hardware, the engine by default will be CPU, which works the best, gives the most accurate results, but is probably the slowest from all of these, depending on your hardware. Now, if you have a laptop or something that doesn't have a strong integrated graphics card, you may be only able to use CPU. And if you have a NVIDIA card with CUDA, you can use that, which will use the video card to run it, which can go a lot faster, but does sometimes not work with all features. Similar to RTX, if you have a more recent card with the RTX ray tracing engine, that'll also go quite a bit faster, but doesn't work with all features. So try them out, but I'll leave it on CPU for now since that works well for us. Interactive render is a real-time representation of what's going on, so it's kind of live updating, but then you don't get quite the same quality of results, so it lets you make sure things are kind of looking okay before you go into a longer render. And the amount of interactivity is just the quality level. You can play around with that. Effects we're not going to worry about. It has a few built-in denoisers. This tries to continue to refine an image, especially when it doesn't have enough lighting, to reduce dots and fuzzies and noise. You know, probably don't need it for interactive, but it's great for doing other rendering if you have the hardware. You've got options about a camera. So in the computer, when you're doing a rendering program, whether that's Rhino or anything else, it is simulating how a real camera works. And so in this case, this gives you access to some of those parameters to set, such as standard camera, or you can do VR and other types there. You can do stereo for 3D stuff. It has an exposure feature, right, which you could turn on and off, and maybe to see a little bit of what's going on here, what I'm going to do is click on this icon with a teapot in a hand. Teapot almost always means render, or some kind of object from back in the day, and then this one is the interactive render. If I open that up, do a little adjusting here, and there you go. You can see this, and if I move around in my view off to the right there, you can see it moving and updating along the way. You might even hear my computer's fans ramp up as it starts putting a little pressure on the CPU. But that's, you know, very flat, no lighting. It's just roughly simulating an object floating in a void with no kind of definition to it. We'll get to that. So if I turn off exposure, now it's like not trying to simulate a camera's exposure. It's just all the light all the time. So it gets a lot lighter, but has less of a realistic feel. And then we've got things like white balance if you want to play and adjust kind of the color balance to it. More warm, more cool, something funky, whatever. That works there. Depth of field is just kind of a visual effect to create blur and distinction from foreground and background. We probably don't need it on right now, but it can be nice for making things look a little bit more photoreal. You have effects that are, you know, here vignetting and tilt shift conditions. Those are more camera effects we can look at. So just some basic setups for the camera. Important thing here is like exposure. If you put this in EVs really low, so like a, I don't know, 1.4 or something, right? It's letting a lot of light in to the scene, so it's just super overexposed. And if I make this really high, 16 f-stop or something, it's like losing its thing. So, you know, sorry, it defaults around 10 or so, and you might play with it back and forth. It also has an auto option over here, which I'm not sure, it's not always engaged, and I think you have to kind of stop the render fully. Sometimes if you can't access a setting, you need to fully stop the render. Sometimes it's just not compatible with our current settings. So whatever, we'll keep that going just so we see what happens. Close the camera view. We have render output. This is like what you're going to see, what size image is going to be, the aspect ratio. And it also allows you to do this safe frame option. You can see there a little bit on the right hand side that there's some guides happening in my respective window, and these are just kind of standard film guides of safe frame and safe title, or save action and save title. Cover that at another time. And then a standard widescreen resolution, but you can choose a bunch of other ones and do whatever you like. Custom match viewport. So I'll leave mine at 1920 by 1080. If your renders are going very slow, you can always make this quite a bit smaller, keeping the aspect ratio. That helps out. And if you're working on an animation, it can pick up animation sources from Rhino, like a camera path animation, and we can do some from Grasshopper as well. Environment, this is right now, just using a environment texture of nothing. So it just not even finding my environment because it was probably set up on a different computer. And we could, trash, get rid of that even if it lets us. So there's no environment now. It'll switch to using Rhino Sun if that's on. It basically just has no environment right now. It turned to black out there, and it's not influencing the light or anything like that. And if you didn't want your environment to affect your object, you can turn that on and off. You can choose whether it affects global illumination, which is the soft shading and bouncing of light, reflection, refraction, and some other secondary kind of light bounce effects. So we'll get back to that when we have to deal with environments. Material override. This one can be really useful early on. Maybe you're playing around with materials, just trying to see if they look good, applying stuff, but then it's harder to see if your lighting's working exactly right. And so you can always come here to the settings and hit material override to put kind of a generic clay or something onto the material without having to change all of your textures. So if I do that, all right, this is set to some weird blue color, and we got this override there. You can choose a material. So what I might do is create a generic or just basic V-Ray material to do this. Or you can just have an override color. And you can see as I move this around, that's changing my color there, just on a standard kind of color wheel. And I'd probably start with something with just a little bit of gray over there as a good override material. It's about the same as whatever's in Rhino. Swarm is a rendering engine for doing larger renders. We've got our render parameters. The defaults here are fine to start with. A lot of these get into optimizations or color management and things like that. So I'm going to leave them as they are until they become important. But you can look through them really quick. If you're familiar with a standard kind of film camera, we can play around with ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed. So if I was doing an animation and I wanted it at 30 frames per second, I'd probably set my shutter speed to 60, which is 2 times the frame rate, and that provides just enough motion blur to like have a cinematic effect, but not so much that it's mushy and not so little that it feels really, really fake. A lot of film is shot at 5.6 f-stop, so I like to set it there to start with unless I'm doing something specific. And then that all these kind of are linked together, so it'll adjust the ISO relative to your exposure values and your lights in the scene to make it look kind of right. And you can tweak these if it's too bright or too dark. ISO is digital light. You also add a bokeh, which is blurriness in the background to lights. You can do volumetric environments like fog and things to make stuff have a little bit of atmosphere to it. You can render the contours in a scene. There you go. So if you want a little edge on your object, help see the definition for a diagram or something, that's pretty nice. And then you have denoiser settings, which are really more in effect on the final render, not so much in the viewport. They don't matter that much, and they're not accessible while it's rendering. And then these are basic configurations for the overall system that don't affect our rendering that much. So there's kind of working. It updates in real time. And this is very simple for it to render because there's nothing really there. But there's our render settings. So why don't we see what some of these do? And we can just come up here to the materials tab. If we click on it and there's no materials in the scene right now, it's okay, make something generic, emissive. These are kind of your basics. The generic material can do a little of everything. Emissive is for making things glow like a light bulb or something like that. Then we've got some specialized ones, two-sided, so you can see the inside and the outside the same. Car paint adds kind of that layer or multi-layered effect that cars have in terms of like the clear coat, the color coat, speckles, whatever. Subsurface is for like skin, and hair is hair. And then you've got a few kind of add-ons to materials, bump mapping, blending, multi-material. They get more advanced. Won't worry about them. So let's just create a generic material. And maybe I'll just leave it named generic. We see it comes in at kind of a gray color. It has no reflection here, but if we play with some of these, like we can make it shiny or not. That does nothing without reflection, has no index of refraction. It has no refraction, no transparency, or this will give it some transparency like glass. No coat, no opacity, no bump. Don't even need it on, doesn't have an effect. So it's just very generic material that we could build up from. But I want it to stay pretty neutral like this, because I can come back to my settings and go to material override over here. Again, click that on, choose generic. And now that will be my baseline material that I can swap between if I want to see whatever's on the object. That's the Rhino default, and whatever I put on the object, this one here. So if I go back over to materials, now I have a list here. And if I want to add a new one, I can come down here to the bottom and look at all the stuff. So if I want to add materials, there we go, another generic. You can import assets, you can save it. So if you made a file that works really well as a baseline for your renderings, you can save it out as a base asset set and then import it to new files, and you can delete things and clean up junk. So with this generic, right, just to see what it does, there we can see, make it totally black, picks up no light, so it just vanishes, make it all the way white. All right, has a little bit of soft shading in there because of global illumination, but mostly it just overexposes everything. So we want it like, a little bit of gray. We're able to see it updating with the real-time renderer, and we got some geometry there. So that's pretty much an intro to what we would need to see in V-Ray. There's a lot of other advanced things like our light. Again, it's picking up the Rhino sun, which I don't think is even turned on right now. But if we go back to our full screen there, we can check it out and see. And my sun over here, and it's turned off. I turn it on. All right, we see, whoa, got some bit of color coming in, way overexposed. So we'd have to come back into our V-Ray settings, check out our camera, and probably bring that down a little bit, maybe around 10 or 11 for now. It's still pretty overexposed on that material, and that's partly because we don't have an environment, nothing softening out the light. And the sun is a pretty harsh light source, so we might even have to adjust that exposure a little bit more for now if that's our only light. Yeah, you can start to see a little bit there, and that could also be some advanced camera properties. And that's a very funny low ISO. Yeah, really. That at 100, let's see what happens. Okay, so this I think just changes, right? This over here, so it's just simulating ISO. And put that at 50. Now we can kind of get a little bit of sense of dimension to this window here. Let's move it down there and make it a little bigger for everybody and see what's going on. Anyway, so a lot of those settings kind of work together when you need to resolve something. If I zoom in and out, I can do some framing. Go on the shadowy side, we're getting a little bit of light that bounces and leaks underneath there just from the default solution. But this isn't a sun rendering thing, so let's turn that off. You can also see what happens if you turn on the Rhino skylight. You see it's changing the viewport, but not the rendering. And so this right now is just something that Rhino will do here. And often with V-Ray, you might have to play with this because it won't look the same in the viewport as it does over here in the rendering. But you can always click that on and off if you need to see something in the geometry or the harsher lighting, the shadows, or if you want to see it a little bit soft shaded. And I find it often gets overexposed because they don't communicate perfectly. All right, so let's cut it there for just the basic intro. Things are working, and then we'll come back around and do a basic lighting solution. Okay, so Rhino has a bunch of lights. If you go to the render menu, you can create spotlights, point lights, directional, rectangular, and linear lights, and they'll work in V-Ray. They may not be as efficient or have quite the same level of quality, and their control system's a little different. So if you're used to those, you could start there, but we might as well just begin in V-Ray and go to our light tab, and down a little plus sign at the bottom, we can make new lights. If we want to work with an outside environment, we would create a dome light and maybe put an HDR image on it. If we want to work with very specific engineered numbers for lights. You can do AES lights or import them from places. Some standard ones, spotlights, familiar how that works with a bit of a cone. A sphere light is, kind of like an omni light, a sphere light, just like a little glowing sphere like a light bulb, but a little more efficient. An omni light just puts light in all directions and, again, operates kind of like a light bulb. Mesh light will make an object turn into a light, whatever the mesh is. I like to use a lot of rectangular lights. They're like big, diffuse light sources. So you can use it and think of it in photography like a big sheet of foam core bouncing light, or a light with a big diffuser or reflector on it. So I'm just going to create one of those. And instantly, right, my scene in Rhino got a lot darker because it's now trying to simulate that light, but it's not quite doing it the same as whatever my V-Ray window over here is doing. And you may from time to time find you need to restart the interactive renderer, but in this case, it's just not picking anything up because that light is really small and far away. If I turn on the skylight now, because I want to see stuff in my viewport, that can be helpful, but let's leave it off to really work with the lighting solution. I'll move this down over here so I can get to my top view, as it will by default create these lights over at 0, 0. And I can move it towards my geometry, and I need to go into a side view and move it up. And now you can see, oh, there we go. We got just a little bit of light happening there. And if you look into my render window, there's a little occluded rectangle, just an thin plane that is projecting the light and is visible there. And you can change that visibility of it, but it's not going to affect us too much. Let's just go straight up so it's out of the scene and start to play with its intensity so that we get some lighting effects. So what I'll first do is look at the rectangular light there. It's got a 30 intensity, whereas the sun is 1. And this is just a mismatch between how Rhino does its lights and how V-Ray does its lights on different scales. So you can think of this as 0.3 relative to Rhino lights, whatever. It's a third. So if I were to put this up to 100, well, we saw a little bit there. If I put it up to like 10,000 now, we're starting to get some lights. And some of this depends on how it's being controlled and what scale it's in. So I have the default scaler over here, which is something in Rhino. You can do it by lumens if you know what the light's lumen is and you're trying to replicate an actual light. You can do it other forms of measures of luminance and watts and then whatever. So if I change it to lumens, right now it's putting out about 1,000 lumen or 10,000 lumens relative to the scale of this. And let's see how big we are looking. That's 48 inches, assuming that our file here is in inches. Oops, there's our units. Yes, inches. Okay. So it takes a lot of lumens and they're affected by distance. So now I might want to take this and bring it down closer, and it's starting to have an effect. I also think, all right, we can make it quite a bit bigger. You can change the size here. And you'll see that changing there in the top view. So maybe I'll make it like a 36 by 36 light source. And right now it's a rectangular light source. And you can see that it's really oversaturating the Rhino view, but not getting a whole lot of light here in the rendered view. It's like a good even amount of light. So that becomes kind of an issue, and you have to use this interactive view to really see what's going on. Let's swap things around a little bit, just so you can see them side by side. And we're pretty close. We're just a couple feet away. If I move further, I start to lose light. This rectangular light could also be a disk if you were mimicking like a photo light or something, or if you're mimicking more of a fluorescent light source. And it has a few parameters like directionality. The lower this number is, right, the more it just spreads out. So it's really diffuse. And if I bring it way in, it's like a spotlight there. And that could be used for a dramatic effect, whatever you'd like. But let's give it just a little directionality, not too much. Remember before we saw it in our scene, so if I bring it back down, right there it is in the rendering. I can make sure it's invisible, so it's just there for lighting if I don't want it in my way. If I turn off decay, you can see there it gets a bit more light, but a little less natural. It can turn off shadows, so it gets flatter. Double side doesn't matter. It's affecting all of these different parts of an object, the diffuse or color, the specular or the shininess, the reflections, things that it'll be in a reflection, and the atmospherics, which is like fog or something. Caustics, don't really need to worry about right now. There's not much else to this light, you know, and if I switch it back to this, right, super bright on the default scaler at that level. Let's put it back to lumens. Let's see what happens if we turn on our skylight. Sometimes that can fix a little bit of the problems. Oops. There in the window, but it seems just a little broken. So we'll just use it. And sometimes then it's like, okay, well, that's not going to help. So I can just go to shaded view so I can pick my view and apply materials. And sometimes you have to, you know, come here. Let's say it's giving a little bit of trouble. I like to select my lights. It's really close to the surface. There we go. Put it on its own layer called lights. And I can turn it on and off if I need to like look at textures or something like that. So a basic lighting setup for something like this, or like an overhead light might make sense just to give it a little dramatic effect, but we might want just a bit of an angle to it. So here I can start to experiment with how I rotate this light, put it there at a 45, maybe go this way at a 45. I'm gonna bring it off to the side and just get a little bit of light coming on that front edge. And you can copy these, but it does a few kind of weird things. So sometimes it's better just create a new one, light, rectangular. Ooh, a bright one. Let's give it that. And let's just keep our size the same. 36, 36. Bring that over into play. Oops. Move it up here. Now that one's a much higher intensity light, and it's still on the default scaler, but even on lumens, it's pretty intense. And so I might need to make some adjustments there, but for right now, let's see if we can kind of bring this in from the side. All right, and now maybe this one starts to become our key light, or a light that's providing most of our light. And this one over here becomes our fill light, just giving us a general fill, and that number is probably just a little too big. Okay, that's a little bit better. Move it up a little further away. Maybe bring this down so we just get more general light. And that's kind of nice and dramatic. Make it invisible so it never gets in the way. And that's doing a pretty good job since we don't have an atmosphere or a studio environment right now, where we just have a subtle difference on the top versus the front face versus the side face. This could maybe be a little bit better. Let's rotate the view a little just to see, right? Because we're not getting a lot of contrast there. So what if I move that up? There we go. Now we're getting a little more contrast between the front, the top, the side, just so we have like a, you know, general decent lighting view. And that's not a bad place to start. A little dark. If you don't have enough light in the scene, it will actually take V-Ray quite a long time to render. It's a very simple object right now, but as things get more complex, it might start to get pretty slow. And this probably, I'm going to want to move in a little closer, get a little bit more over the top of it. All right, so it's not so highlighted on the edge. Further away the light source is, the softer it is, the closer it is, the harsher it is. So you can always play with that a little and increase the intensity and the directionality. And we have a pretty basic scene setup to start playing with. And we might want to give a little background separation here. So I'm going to go ahead and create one more light. Right now I'll try a little sphere light here just to see what this does. All right, if I put this in the background, play around again, put my lumens, or we need to give this a pretty big number. Maybe we'll give it a color so we can see what's going on. And check out in our top view, right? This light is kind of back behind there. Not really seeing the effects yet, so we might need to bump that up quite a bit. Maybe move it up here just so we see it. You can see it's a quite localized effect right now, and we might have to play with the size. Whoa. That light, which seems to be doing a little bit of funniness there. And what if it's invisible? And give it up to 10,000. You can see the effects of that. I don't really want this light in here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And instead, we'll leave it how it is for right now. And we'll come back into this later. So, stay tuned for setting up some more dramatic light and moving this into materials, but it's a good starting place for now.